Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and today we're talking about Carl Sagan. I've got Dr. William Lane Craig.
Cameron, if you're going to insist on saying doctor every time you mention Bill, and you are, per standard apologetic practice, at least be sure to do the same for Dr. Carl Sagan, please.
Just to be fair as we can.
So, what does Dr. William Lane Craig think of Dr. and Professor Carl Sagan?
Well, he was ahead of his time, really. As I watched these clips that you sent me, Cameron, I was just struck at how similar he is to Richard Dawkins.
Talking of being struck, I'm struck by Bill here. I mean, Carl and Richard are both science communicators, but their tone alone is very different.
He has the same debonair demeanor, the dashing personality.
That's our first disagreement, I guess. While both are brilliant, Richard has always struck me as a no-nonsense kind of guy, who comes off as a tad, shall we say, abrasive. Carl, on the other hand, has always struck me as almost unreasonably kind and gentle.
He was a lot, I think, different than, at least in his sort of tone and approach to religion. He seems a lot more respectful.
Yeah. Precisely. Carl was compassionate and very patient. When theologians, apologists, and laypeople made bold claims about astrophysics that are unfounded, such as that the Big Bang is the beginning of everything, Carl wouldn't mock them as ill-informed.
He seems a lot more respectful.
And on the note of respect, Cameron proceeds to warn his audience of how ill-informed and cringy Mr. Carl is on philosophy.
There were some bits and pieces that are obviously, for anyone who follows apologetics or philosophy, it's going to be kind of cringy for listening to someone who is not really a philosopher, not really informed on philosophy, religion, pontificating on these matters. It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that.
And fortunately for you lovely lot watching, you're going to see, in this very response, Cameron calmly educate Carl.
It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that.
All right, let's get to it.
What is your personal religion, or is there any type of God to you? Like, is there a purpose, given that we're just sitting on this speck in the middle of this sea of stars? Humans have created a mythological framework that often involves some kind of higher spiritual powers. And as
every human culture has done,
as that goes away, as we know more and more and it seems harder and harder to prove that anything might exist like that, where does that leave us?
on our own, which to my mind is much more responsible than hoping that someone will save us from ourselves so we don't have to make our best efforts to do it ourselves. And if we're wrong, and there is someone who steps in and saves us, okay, that's all right. I'm for that, but we, hedged our bets. It's Pascal's bargain run backwards.
You know what? I really miss Carl, and I know that I'm not alone. He was just such a gentle and brilliant ape. Right then, the questioner asked whether 1, Carl believes in God, and if so, what type of God?
What is your personal religion, or is there any type of God to you?
And 2, the questioner expressed that since it's getting harder and harder to uphold a mythological framework, he wants to know where Carl thinks this leaves us.
Where does that leave us?
And Carl responded to the second objection, saying that if there is no higher power, then we are on our own.
On our own, which to my mind is much more responsible than hoping that someone will save us from ourselves so we don't have to make our best efforts to do it ourselves.
So Carl not only said that this leaves us on our own, but that this very fact causes us to take responsibility for justice, the planet, etc. Finally, Carl emphasised that even if it turns out that there is a higher power, we're better off taking maximal responsibility and doing our best to save ourselves from ourselves.
It's Pascal's bargain run backwards.
Now then, let's see whether Cameron and Bill got the same takeaway.
All right, so that's where we'll stop it for the first clip. So kind of the 2 points that he makes here that I caught was we're on our own, which is more responsible than relying on someone else to do it for us. And then he says if there is a God, then we say we hedged our bets. It's Pascal's bargain. He doesn't say Pascal's wager, he says Pascal's bargain run backwards.
Yeah, he used a synonym of wager, didn't he? Pretty cringe, I guess.
It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that.
So let's get your thoughts on this initial clip here.
Well, as hard as it might be to believe, Cameron, it is not becoming harder to prove the existence of God in comparison to earlier centuries.
Well, I must say, this is going to be pretty interesting, since more than ever, scientists and philosophers are atheists.
On the contrary, I should say, the evidence from the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the uncanny applicability of mathematics to physical phenomena, new insights into the ontological argument actually make it easier to prove God's existence today than in previous centuries.
Now, if this is the case, then we have a peculiar paradox. Why is it that those who study these fields, those who really understand these new findings, are less convinced of God's existence than their predecessors who knew less? Why is it that as we stand upon taller and taller shoulders, we see less and less of God? I appreciate that Bill might be convinced that the evidence is better than ever for God, but the fact remains that those who most study the fields that he's referencing, they don't. They simply don't share Bill's optimism, for if they did, they would likewise believe.
And then, of course, the rise of modern historiography and investigation of the New Testament documents makes it vastly easier to prove the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes, the historical Jesus, a man who lived in the 1st century, has become easier to prove due to such discoveries as the Pilate Stone. But when it comes to the biblical Jesus, there have been many discoveries that weaken the case. For instance, the Gospel of Matthew describes the massacre of the innocents ordered by King Herod after Jesus' birth. But discovered historical records say that Herod died in 4 BC, which is, of course, before the birth of Christ.
And what do you know? They don't add up.
In any case, if it were true to say that it's easier than ever to prove the biblical Jesus, then why is it that, once again, more scholars are atheist than ever before? Many of these now experts started their journey as devout believers, and yet it's precisely due to their close analysis that they've decided to rise from their knees.
So I think we're actually very well positioned to provide evidence and argument for God's existence. By contrast, the claim that we are on our own is atheism, and that requires proof. And I don't know of any proof that exists that we are on our own.
But Bill, Carl and the questioner never asserted that there is no higher power. The questioner expressed that it's harder and harder to believe in God, which, let's face it, the fact that naturalism dominates academia certainly supports this. But the questioner never claimed that there is no higher power. Likewise, Carl didn't claim that there is no God. He simply answered the questioner by saying that in a world where it becomes more and more difficult to believe in God, this leaves us on our own.
On our own.
Now, this reverse Pascal's wager makes no sense at all. The idea here would be that if we deny God's existence, and it turns out that God does exist, then we shall be better off than if we believed in him and he exists. And that's obviously not true. On the contrary, we might be a whole lot worse off if we don't believe in God and it turns out that he exists. So this reverse Pascal's wager, I think, is quite hopeless.
All right, so Bill says that Carl's reverse Pascal's wager isn't all that great.
This reverse Pascal's wager makes no sense at all.
But notice the additional premise that Bill snuck in.
We might be a whole lot worse off if we don't believe in God.
Why is that, Bill? Why would we be a whole lot worse off by simply not being convinced of a God's existence? Why would any God worthy of worship punish people not on the content of their character, but rather on what they believe? Well, we know what Bill is driving at, don't we? The eternal flames, or at the very least, utter annihilation that meek and mild Jesus will cast upon us if we can't somehow convince ourselves of such nonsense as inherited sin, virgin births, and scapegoating. But here's the thing, these views are not the only ones in town. Inclusivists maintain that Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection are the means of salvation for all humanity, but explicit knowledge of Christ or conscious belief in him is not necessary for salvation. What's more, consider universalism, the view that eventually all will be saved and reconciled with God. Sure, this hasn't been popular throughout history, but it's always been appealing to well-respected theologians, from Origen of Alexandria in the 2nd century all the way to David Bentley Hart today. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Josh Rasmussen, a board member of Cameron's Capturing Christianity, is also persuaded by universalism. And under a rubric such as outlined, Carl's wager absolutely makes sense. If we act as if there is no God and thus take responsibility to ensure justice and save our planet, and it turns out that there is no God, then at least we've done our best. But if it turns out that there is a God, then great. Because while it's true that God could, and likely would, ensure justice with a click of his fingers, guess what? The soul building and character development we would have received by doing our best to take responsibility is surely precisely the kind of thing that an all-loving God would desire. No?
Yeah, I didn't even understand what it meant. I was going to ask you, like, what do you think he even meant by Pascal's bargain run backwards? It just doesn't even make sense to me.
Yeah.
I've got to admit, I'm genuinely surprised that Cameron and Bill didn't understand Carl drawing an analogy with Pascal. I guess, on the one hand, they get to dismiss him as misinformed and cringy.
This reverse Pascal's wager makes no sense at all.
It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that.
And this adds, of course, to Cameron correcting Mr. Kyle on it being Pascal's wager instead of Pascal's bargain, as if all of a sudden it's cringe to use a synonym.
It's Pascal's bargain. He doesn't say Pascal's wager, says Pascal's bargain.
But on the other hand, Cameron and Bill evidently maintain that their loving God will come down upon those that are not convinced with great vengeance and furious anger. And so perhaps they can't quite get into the headspace of the many prominent Christian philosophers, or I should say, in Bill's case, the many other prominent Christian philosophers that uphold opposing doctrines, who I'm fairly certain would not only understand Carl's point, but sign off on it. Now, within their chat, Bill expressed how many atheists can be rude and nasty.
I think it's usually the popularizers that are the ones that are so rude and nasty.
And maybe you could say this of me right now. I mean, I'm certainly being facetious. What's more, I've definitely received this accusation from apologists in the past. But it's my view that apologists are reaping what they sow. While they dress themselves in a kind and gentle garb, much of what they do is actually very rude and very nasty, and what we've seen here is just one example. Look, rather than Bill and Cameron considering that maybe they haven't quite got to grips with what Carl's reasoning is because they haven't paid enough attention.
I mean, I haven't really paid very close attention.
Bill has said that Carl's making no sense at all.
No sense at all.
And Cameron has insinuated that Carl is cringy.
It's always kind of cringy when you come up against that.
But in any case, I don't think they quite got the better of Carl on this one. Be sure to subscribe though, as I'm sure I'll offer more critique of their epic takedown of the lovely Carl every few videos or so. Thank you.